Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is promising a new deal for the American people. The year is 1930. Roosevelt is fresh from his second-term victory as governor of New York, and the very next day, Jim Farley, the chair of the Democratic Party in the state, told reporters, "I do not see how Mr. Roosevelt can escape becoming the next presidential nominee of his party, even if no one should raise a finger to bring it about." Now, Roosevelt spent the next year basically saying, no, I'm not running. I'm just working here as governor. But behind the scenes, getting that campaign up and running, certainly it was about to start. In fact, he told Farley privately he had no problem with that statement. Now, Governor Roosevelt would run the state while Howe was off to New York City to kind of get that campaign apparatus up and running for the presidential run that they were looking forward to in 1932. In the meantime, Farley actually hit the road. He visited 18 states in 19 days, talking to Democratic leaders all over the country. The feedback about Roosevelt, very positive. Roosevelt himself spent some time in Warm Springs back in Georgia, where he started welcoming potential delegates, Democratic leaders from the South, to meet him personally. That Roosevelt charm and optimism, well, very much aligned. Things were looking pretty good. But again, what about his health? We talked in a previous episode how the health issue was kind of put aside in the state of New York, but now we're talking nationally. What do the people think about someone who had suffered from polio and was paralyzed from the waist down? Was he up to being president of the United States? Well, Roosevelt actually got an assist from a Republican journalist by the name of Earle. He called for an independent medical evaluation of Roosevelt and also some unannounced visits where he and others could actually go watch Roosevelt at any time they wanted to see if he was actually up to the job. Well, the three doctors came in, examined Roosevelt, gave him basically a clean bill of health. We believe his powers of endurance are such as to allow him to meet all demands of private or public life. That was looking pretty good. What about those unannounced visits, though? Looker was part of the folks who came in and really took an eye on Roosevelt as governor, and he came away very impressed. "I observed him working and resting. I noted the alertness of his movements, the sparkle of his eyes, the vigor of his gestures. I saw his strength under the strain of long working periods. Insofar as I had observed him, I came to the conclusion that he seemed able to take more punishment than many men 10 years younger. Merely his knees were not much good to him. I'm able to say unhesitatingly that every rumor of Franklin Roosevelt's physical incapacity can be unqualifiedly defined as false." Very helpful and good education for the American public about what you could or could not do after having a disease like polio and paralysis. Looks like he could certainly do the job as governor and president of the United States. Now, Roosevelt was not the only person in contention for the Democratic nomination in 1932. Al Smith, his former colleague and mentor in some ways, and now very much estranged from Roosevelt, he wanted to get back in the race. He had been the candidate in 1928. John Garner, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, is interested in the presidency as well. Now, Howe and Farley basically focused on running the campaign. As for policies, Roosevelt turned a bit to academia. In fact, some professors from Columbia University, led by Raymond Moley, Rex Tugwell, Adolf Berle, these folks were becoming what we called the brain trust for Franklin Roosevelt, unpaid advisors who was there to help him sort of figure out these policies. And they started making trips to Albany on a regular basis. They would meet with the governor after dinner well into the night, where they would bring some guests and they would poke and prod on policy issues, trying to help Roosevelt really figure out where he stood on all of these key issues. Well, early in 1932, Roosevelt back to Warm Springs for some time there, but he said, "Look, Moley, you take lead of the brain trust. Keep going. Take these policy ideas, turn them into speeches that I can give." One of the first and one of the most famous at the outset of the campaign, the Forgotten Man speech, April 7th of 1932, in which he said that these unhappy times call for the building of plans that rest upon the forgotten, the unorganized but the indispensable units of economic power, for plans that build from the bottom up and not from the top down, and put their faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic period. Millions were struggling with the Depression right now in the United States. If business was going to abandon them, well, maybe the government needs to step in and help out here. Critics cried socialism in direction of Roosevelt, but the ideas were starting to catch fire with the American people. Roosevelt was also promising to be an innovator and a risk taker on behalf of those people. He said at Oglethorpe University, "The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It's common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." As far as they were concerned, Herbert Hoover wasn't doing very much. At least that's how they painted him as President of the United States in the Depression. Roosevelt would certainly be different. The Democrats gathered in convention June 27, 1932, 30,000 people getting there in Chicago. But 1,154 were the ones that mattered. They were the delegates who were going to elect the nominee. Now, the major issue going in was he knew he had a majority of the vote. He was pretty confident of that, but you got to get to 2/3 supermajority in the Democratic Party still. It would be the last time that would be the case, but he still needed 2/3. That was going to be a little bit tricky. The keynote address was given by Senator Alben Barkley, kind of kicked things off, really hammering Hoover and his job during the Depression. And then it was time to start the nominations. The nominating speeches were given. By the time they started voting, it was almost 4:30 in the morning. Roosevelt did come out on top in that first ballot, but he was not there at the 2/3 supermajority. They talked about, look, it's getting really late. Maybe we take a break. And Roosevelt, who's listening to all of this back in New York, says, no, 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 to his advisors. Got to keep going. Keep the momentum going. Well, they took a couple of more votes. Not a lot of change. And by 9 o'clock, they said, look, enough. Our folks are tired. We've got to send them home to rest. We'll start again the next evening. Well, Roosevelt knew he needed to get some momentum going, to expand on his lead, or else folks might be starting to look elsewhere. So maybe it was time to make a deal. Now, they knew Al Smith and his team weren't going to make any deals because he and Roosevelt were very much estranged at this point. But what about John Garner? Garner held about 90 votes in 2 states, really, his state of Texas and also the state of California. So eventually they basically put the VP slot on the table for Garner. If he would pass on his delegates over to Roosevelt, that would be available to him. And Garner eventually agreed. He did put Roosevelt over the top on the next ballot and the next day as California and Texas got in line. Basically, everybody eventually did except Smith's folks. They stayed on the outside. And then as soon as he got the nomination, and by the way, Garner did get the VP nod as well, Roosevelt put a shock into the system when he sent a telegram to the convention almost immediately saying he was going to do something nobody else had done before. He was going to come to the convention and accept the nomination in person. Now, he was going to fly from Albany to Chicago. To do that, he had to make stops for refueling in Buffalo and in Cleveland. It took about 7 or 8 hours. Think about 7 or 8 hours to fly from Albany to Chicago, but this was breaking new ground. And Roosevelt arrived, great cheers at the convention, and he told folks that, look, let it be symbolic that I broke traditions. Let it be now, from now on, the task of our party to break foolish traditions. He was going to be a new kind of candidate and maybe a new kind of president. And then he unveiled a very famous speech in terms of giving his campaign theme, where he promised, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people. A new deal for the American people. That was the phrase that everybody remembered, very much in contrast to maybe the old deal that folks were painting with Herbert Hoover and his struggles during the Depression. Well, it actually helped over the last 3 years for Roosevelt's campaign what the Democratic Party had already been doing. In doing so, they had hired, just after the 28 election, Charles Michelson. Charlie Michelson was a really talented reporter, and they hired him as the press agent for the Democratic Party, and he was incessant in building out speeches and press releases and articles and political cartoons attacking Herbert Hoover over and over again, painting the entire Depression as the Hoover Depression. He came up with the title Hoovervilles, which was the makeshift shanty towns. People had been tossed out of their homes because of the Depression. They were now living in what were called Hoovervilles, and they made Hoover come across as a dour, do-nothing, uncaring man. Didn't matter how much hard work Hoover was doing behind the scenes to try to overcome the Depression. He certainly didn't help himself, and Charlie Michelson and his cadre were really sending these messages along. Michelson said, look, the contrast between the gloomy occupant of the White House, whom we refer to as the author of the Depression, and the vibrant Democratic candidate with his words of hope and cheer, well, this was having a big difference. The power of propaganda, especially in the hands of a pro like Michelson. Well, Roosevelt got into the campaign spirit right away, and according to Ray Moley, look, campaigning for him was unadulterated joy. Roosevelt loved this. His optimism, his smile, he would certainly be attacking Hoover, talking about his own policies, and then Hoover had another struggle. Veterans. World War I vets had received a bonus agreement that Congress passed over Calvin Coolidge's veto back in the 1920s. But the bonus was not going to be paid until 1945, so very much of a pension kind of concept. Well, the veterans were all struggling now in the Depression. They wanted that money now. Herbert Hoover was saying, no, I can't help one single group as opposed to others. Well, the veterans decided to take things into their own hands with a march on Washington. Up to about 20,000 veterans showing up in Washington, D.C., making these makeshift camps, turning a situation very tense in the nation's capital. The House of Representatives voted in favor of the veterans to accelerate those payments, but when it went to the United States Senate, they said no, the vote was not close. Hoover actually lobbied Congress to appropriate some money to pay for the veterans to actually return home, and many thousands of them did, but many thousands did not. They decided to stay in Washington in these makeshift camps and continue to demonstrate and argue for their cause. Well, things got eventually violent. July the 28th of 1932, a battle ensued between the D.C. police and some of the veterans. 2 vets were killed. D.C. police says, look, this is out of our hands. They asked President Hoover for help from the military. Hoover sent in Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, and his job, remove the vets beyond the city limits, but don't cross the rivers, don't go into the camps on the other side of the Potomac or the Anacostia River, just get them out of Washington, D.C. proper. Well, MacArthur wasn't going to mess around. He brought the power of the U.S. Army. Troops with bayonets, cavalry with sabers drawn, 6 light tanks, plenty of tear gas to move those veterans out, which they did out of the city, but he did not stop at the bridges. Crossed over that night, burned all the camps. Now, from a mission standpoint, seems like success for MacArthur, but politically, this was a disaster for Herbert Hoover. Newsreels across the country playing these scenes over and over again as the active army taking out violence against their former colleagues, the tear gas and the flames. This looked terrible. It was all good for Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, Roosevelt made the comment to his friend Felix Frankfurter, Felix, well, this elects me. The campaign continued for Roosevelt. Similar themes continued to be put forward by the candidate. Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, he gave a speech in which he said, a glance at the situation today only too clearly indicates that equality of opportunity, as we have known it, no longer exists. Our government, formal and informal, political and economic, owes to everyone an avenue to possess himself of a portion of that plenty sufficient for his needs through his own works. That was not happening anymore. He would change that if he became president. Now, he also made some interesting proposals, including about the tariff. He tripped up a little bit on this topic because the party was really split. Protection, free trade. He called for more protection, but the farmers howled about this. They thought that was bad for them, and Roosevelt actually immediately backtracked. No, that's not what I meant. No high tariffs for farm products. And Herbert Hoover jumped in and said, look, this was the most startling shift in position by a presidential candidate in the midst of a political campaign in all recent political history. Well, as for Roosevelt, he just smiled, waved, and moved on. There were some proposals from Roosevelt in the campaign that were rather interesting, given where he would eventually go as president, including a call for a balanced budget and the need to cut spending. According to Roosevelt, I promise an immediate and drastic reduction of government expenditures to accomplish a saving of not less than 25% in the cost of federal government. Of course, as president, Roosevelt would spend more than any president in American history, dramatically increasing the deficit and the debt. What about the topic of aid for people who were struggling here in the Depression? Roosevelt said, under no circumstance shall any money be paid in the form of a dole or any other form by the local welfare officer to any unemployed or his family. Of course, again, as president, he actually championed eventually unemployment insurance, which would be a new capability across the country on his watch. Also attacked Herbert Hoover again, saying he did nothing for you as president during this Depression. According to Roosevelt, the present leadership in Washington stands convicted, not because it did not have the means to plan, but fundamentally because it did not have the will to do. I have charged that he did nothing for a long time after the Depression began. I repeat that charge. It is a leadership that is bankrupt, not only in ideals, but also in ideas. Well, Hoover actually got in the game kind of late. He'd really been spending 20 hours a day trying to focus behind the scenes to do whatever he could on the Depression. Again, he wasn't helping himself much with his personality and kind of his secrecy during all of this period, but he came out, look, he was going to fight for his belief in the American system of government, focused on individualism and capitalism, and contrasting that with what he called basically a Marxist view with Roosevelt and the New Deal. According to Hoover, this campaign is more than a contest between two parties. It is a contest between two philosophies of government. That was very much true, but it was also the case that, look, the folks around the country were ready for a change in philosophy of government, a change in leadership. This was going to be a landslide victory for Franklin Roosevelt. The previous election, Hoover had won 40 states. In 1932, he won 6 states. Roosevelt won 42. 57% of the popular vote went to Roosevelt, 89% of the Electoral College. And of course, this was about policies, but as Sam Rosenman said, it was also about the person. According to Rosenman, the novelty was not merely the message, but the messenger, which was very much the case. Roosevelt offering a new deal, a new kind of president, exactly what the electorate was looking to hear. They're going to give him a chance as president of the United States, and he was going to, of course, have significant challenges even before he anticipated. Beginning in the interregnum, almost immediately there were problems that were going to take his time and attention, but that is the story for another day. That's Franklin Roosevelt and promising a new deal for the American people from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.